The world is actually in the middle of a massive transition. It's the biggest economic transition that has ever happened. And at the heart of that is the urbanization that's going on in emerging markets and the creation of, over the next 20 years, another billion jobs, and over the last 20 years, 1 billion jobs. Now, everyone attributes what's going on in emerging markets as urbanization, but the urbanization would not happen if the jobs weren't there. So this is actually the jobs that are driving that, and we're getting a massive change in the global economy. This effect is bigger than the economic impact of the First World War and Second World War put together. It's bigger than the internet. It's 1,000 to 2,000 times bigger than the British Industrial Revolution. And I actually think it's bigger than the plough, the introduction of the plough, though I have to admit I have so far failed to get my academic advisors at the McKinsey Global Institute to sign off on the plough analysis. So we're going to be going through, I'm going to talk a little bit about this transition that's happening. We're going to talk about what that means. And we're going to talk about the bifurcation of the global labour market that we're seeing. Because while this economic change that's happening in the emerging markets is resulting in huge number of people becoming consumers, huge number of people being taken out of poverty, probably more lives being saved than the other big event that saved lives, which is the eradication of smallpox. We're probably saving more lives now through urbanization than we did by eradicating smallpox. But while that's happening, and it's doing a really good job there, and while the high-paid people around the world are getting richer, there is now an underclass developing, and an underclass in developed countries, and that group is now growing up differently than their parents' generation, differently than their grandparents' generation. This group is actually going to grow up poorer than their parents. So we have a lot of the world getting richer, but we get an element, and it's an important element because they're in developed worlds that are going to be becoming poorer. And that is basic, all down to supply and demand. So I'm going to talk about supply and demand of economics, but I thought in the afternoon you guys might not want to see 100 McKinsey charts. We do have a lot of the data, so I can have a few pictures as well to sort of illustrate what's going on in addition to the data. And anyone who wants the data, it's in the book in your bag. So I want to just start by talking about the structural forces that are shaping the global labour market. And start off with this biggest one, the move from agriculture. Now, I was very excited by the chance to come and talk to a group of search consultants because I have a mission here to get a camera and send it back and forward in time in a time machine to take photographs of the world. And I thought, you know, search consultants, you would have placed the people in the companies that have built the time machines. Unfortunately, you will have this code of conduct where you wouldn't tell me which of your clients have time machines. So I've had to resort to some of the traditional way of doing this analysis, which is a McKinsey business analyst and a large computer model to try and do this instead. So I want to put what's going on in the world in context. And just a reminder, every year, 65 million people move from agriculture into cities. That's 65 million people, that's 3.5 New Yorks a year. 7 Chicagos a year, from agriculture into cities. And that happens every year. Now, to put that into context, you've got to get away from the cities. You've got to look at it from distance, and this is the space shots. You can see the world from space, and actually the pictures where the light is corresponds pretty well to where the economic activity is. And you can see this is where the world was in 2000. You know, despite all the reports on BRICS, the BRIC cities were only 6% of GDP. Europe and US dominated the world. The rural part of the world was about 30%. Now imagine we could take this picture and we could send the camera back in time and what the world would look like. And we sent it back 2,000 years, it would look pretty much like that. Now, you know, that was obviously a mistake. So we get the camera back and we adjust the period the light opens. And we take a picture of what the world would look like in the year 1 with a slightly longer exposure. And that's roughly what the world would look like from space. And that's not a world that we're very used to. And some of you may, if we could dim the lights a bit, we might be able to see the pictures a bit better. But it's a slightly different way that we're used to seeing it. And actually, if you look at the numbers on the world, Europe was 13%, China 26, India 33. Different view of the world than the way we're thinking. Other, and it always gives me a certain amount, I very rarely can do analysis where we say other 7% included North America. So other including North America 7%. And that's where the world was 2,000 years ago. So, despite all the things that I learned at school about all of this stuff going on, and all of this stuff, and even the things I read sort of extracurricular at school about things that were going on, actually that wasn't a very good representation of what was happening 2,000 years ago. Because actually 2,000 years ago, the action was all in Asia. Because the differences between GDP per capita around the world in those days was very limited. So the economic activity was where the people were. And actually we run the time machine forward, run it forward, 1,000 years, Roman Empire's fallen apart, we've had all these other stuff, Europe goes down a bit, China goes up a bit, not much has happened. A lot of history, but not much change in economics. We run it another 500 years forward, and again, not much else happens. You can see Europe's come up a bit in terms of some of the numbers, but again, Asia was dominant in terms of the world economy. So 1,500 years economic history, market shares haven't changed much in terms of global economics. Now let's look at the next few years, because something then happened. This happened. And actually, if you take someone from doing this, working in agriculture, and move them to a city, they typically end up, the first year they move, two times richer. And remember, that's why they moved. No one forced them to move. They moved because they could earn more money in the city. There were jobs there, and the jobs paid more because they were more productive. But that wasn't only a one-off effect. The next generation grows up richer too, because they learn more. They're more likely to be better educated. They're actually more likely to be healthier in a city. They're going to have more interactions with other people, so they raise their aspirations. They have the ability to sell things more easily. So you get this different trajectory. People in agriculture, very limited economic growth. People in cities get on a different trajectory. And we can see the effect of the Industrial Revolution. There's our picture 1500. We run it forward to 1913. And we now see how lit up the US is, how lit up Europe is, and how China and India relatively have dimmed. Because you see, when the US was going through all of this, China still looked pretty much the same as it had for 2,000 years. So the Industrial Revolution happened in Europe, happened in the US, and it didn't happen in China. We can run the picture forward again, the page I started with, and then we go to what's happening now. And this is happening now. So we're seeing the Industrial Revolution now happening in emerging markets, but this picture underestimates what's really happening. What's really happening is this. It's at this scale, the Industrial Revolution, a typical Chinese factory just disappearing over the horizon in terms of the activity. And we're seeing the same effect. Actually, we're seeing a slightly higher effect. When you take someone from a village in China and put them in a factory in a city in China, they're typically earning 2 to 3 times the amount that they were earning in subsistence farming. So the same number as the British Industrial Revolution within the order of magnitude in these calculations, we're getting the same effect. And we see that now playing forward. And if we were imagine we can run a picture going forward, that's what the world would look like in 2007, 2025, and 2050, where China, India, much more lit up. And if you look at the numbers, and you can have a lot of discussion about exchange rates and things like this, the India and China cities will be as big as the rest of the world. So this is the major effect. Now, some of you may think I'm just going to have pictures. We will have a bit of analysis. This chart shows the effect by showing how a bunch of countries have followed these lines. You can look at urbanization percentage on the bottom. On the vertical axis, you can see GDP per capita. And you can see that many countries just follow a similar trajectory up in terms of growing their urbanization, growing their GDP per capita. And they're on the same pathway, or very similar pathways. It's just timing differences in terms of how this all happens. Now, we often attribute this to urbanization. And I'm very bad about this, but I go and talk about this as the urbanization effect. But the urbanization would not happen if there weren't jobs for people to move to. So it's the jobs that get people to move to cities. The cities then need to be built. But it's part of what's happening here is the creation of jobs. So this is a major effect, and it's creating a consuming class. But it's happening at a different pace. This is the British Industrial Revolution. Took Britain 150 years to double GDP in the Industrial Revolution, and it started with 10 million people at the start. If you look at a few other countries that did it more recently, Sweden, US, Germany, around 30 years or so, 50 to 30 years, similar sort of population to start. Korea, the country that has most recently done it, did it fastest of anyone, 10 years to double GDP. And China and India are, we think, doing it in around 12 to 15 years. But obviously the scale is different. They're starting with 1 billion people. So to put this in context, what India and China are doing in terms of the Industrial Revolution is orders of magnitude roughly 10 times as fast and 100 times the scale of the British Industrial Revolution. So you think about that. Scale times mass, momentum, force, or whatever, we can be a bit loose on the analogy here. This is 3,000 times the size of the British Industrial Revolution. And think about the impact the British Industrial Revolution had on Britain's social structure, global economic power, etc., etc. We're seeing a force here that's 3,000 times the size. And that's happening, is happening now, and we're at this break point in terms of the global economy, in terms of this happening. Now, this is going to have massive second and third order effects. And many of those are going to be positive, but some of them are going to be negative. And we just need to understand this and understand the consequences for labour. So let's now just put in big global perspective what that means in terms of the history of what has happened over the last 10, 15 years in terms of labour. And actually, over the last 30 years here, the world has actually created close to 1 billion or around 1 billion new jobs outside agriculture. And we talk about non-farm because anyone who doesn't have anything to do in a developing country ends up in agriculture, subsistence farming. So the jobs that matter are the ones that you pull people out of subsistence farming into other things. We can look at how this breaks down, and you can see on this chart how the jobs have been created. The world economy went from 1.7 billion jobs in 1980 to roughly 2.7 billion jobs. We created 1 billion jobs. Which is a phenomenal number if you think about it, in a relatively short period. And that created a consuming class. Now, we have this definition because middle class is a very ill-defined term. So we talk about consuming class. These are people who are able to afford to spend discretionary money, earning more than $10 a day on a PPP basis. They can buy a refrigerator. They're getting close to buying a scooter. They can buy consumer goods. If you're looking around 1970 to 1990, the world only had around 1 billion consuming class people. From 1990 to 2010, the number of consuming class people went from around 1 billion to 2.2 billion, 2.4 billion. And actually, over the next 15 years, it's going to double again. So we're going to go from a world that had about 1 billion consuming class people to about 4 billion consuming class people. That is going to be a huge positive shock, but it's going to be a shock that changes the world in many different ways. We're going to end up with, by 2025, a world where over half the global population will be able to make discretionary expenditure, consumer goods, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the first big change. The second big change is the global integration of labour markets. And there's a lot talked about offshoring and how offshoring is taking away US jobs. When we do the numbers, offshoring, maybe 2 or 3 million jobs have moved. It's very small. The big effect in terms of the way that labour markets have integrated is not about offshoring, it's about normal trade, and it's actually about immigration. So we just look at a few numbers here in terms of this second effect, the integration. First of all, how many jobs that are created in emerging markets are actually related to trade? And in this chart we've gone through, and by emerging markets we said how much of that is the new jobs that created a trade, and you add it all up, you get to around 80 million jobs have been created in emerging markets by trade. So trade is a way of effectively moving jobs from higher cost countries to lower cost countries. But even this trade effect is small in comparison to immigration. When we add up the number of immigrants working in any country outside their home, we have around 200 million immigrants at this point in time who are working in countries outside of their home. Half of whom have come from emerging markets, and half have come from developed countries to other developed countries. So we're in a world where the global integration of the labour markets have happened, and it's a little bit through offshoring, a very small amount. It's mainly through trade and through immigration. And we're getting this effect where global labour markets are linking. And that will come back to, it has some consequences for particularly the underskilled people. So the third, on this effect, 3 out of 4 of the new jobs in advanced economies have either been for increasing participation of women, or it's through immigration. So actually that's what's been the big job creation source in developed markets. The third major change is that we've actually seen a rapid rise in education. This chart just shows that the number of people with tertiary education from 1990 to 2010's actually doubled. The challenge, though, is not the number of new college graduates, is that actually our skill sets required for jobs has actually gone up even faster. If we look at the pattern of job creation and the pattern of job destruction, particularly in developed countries, it's actually very much focused towards skilled people. If we look at the manufacturing jobs, in developed markets, 19 million manufacturing jobs have disappeared. Now, some of that is through moving them overseas, but some of them, this has happened through technology. I remember going around a car plant when I was at Oxford, and there were a lot of people there building a car. You know, you saw all these people with screwdrivers and all of that assembling a car. I went around a car plant in Korea a few months ago, and there was no one there. There were people in control rooms who, when the robots broke down, you know, every couple of weeks, they would come out. And I suspect if I go around a car plant in 20 years' time, there'll be robots sitting in the control room ready to repair the robots when they break down. And the only people would be the people who mend the robots in terms of the way it works. And you know, that's about technology. So manufacturing has been where the jobs have been disappeared. And this is a political problem, because a lot of politicians still have this hang-up about manufacturing going back to sort of, you know, 1930 economics. But, you know, manufacturing is becoming a much smaller part of the way people actually work. The jobs have been created in different categories. There's a category of jobs that we call labour-intensive services. And we created 52 million of those. But the real job creation at real scale has been in this knowledge-intensive. Anything from doctors, nurses, all of you, this is knowledge-intensive. And this has been the big increase. The challenge with these knowledge-intensive ones is that they have become more skilled. Just take the example, you know, 25 years ago, a nurse used to be able to needed to operate 2 pieces of equipment, a thermometer and a stethoscope. Now there is no such thing as a nurse. There are 50 different types of nurses with different capabilities. They all need to be able to operate computers of some type, and it's a different skill set. You used to be able to have school leavers who became, at 15, 16, could become nurses. Now they need to have, you know, at least high school, or maybe even higher than high school, maths to be able to go and do the job. So that's the world we're operating. We're requiring more technology, and those are the jobs we're creating. At the same time, the unskilled jobs, the manufacturing jobs, are disappearing. And then the fifth sort of trend that we've seen is this issue about the rising prosperity and mounting inequality. And the mounting inequality comes from the fact that we are creating jobs requiring skilled people, but globally we're adding to the labour force a whole number of unskilled people through trade. And so what you would expect is supply and demand, that the people with skills are going to be in short supply, because that's where the jobs are being created. Despite the increase in education, it's still short supply. And the unskilled is actually going to be long in supply. And you can see that number in the US. I haven't got the slide here. A high school dropout in the US, salary has been in decline since 1975. So a high school drop, if you were going to be dropping out from high school, you would have wanted to have done it in 1975 because that was the peak compensation year. Since then, salaries have been in decline. The salaries for people with university degrees have been going up since then. Now, this is not some capitalist conspiracy, some failure of the search industry, some terrible issue with HR and how it works in companies. This is just about supply and demand. You know, we've got more supply of unskilled people. All the jobs that created the demand have been for skilled people. we're going to see this change in compensation. And so if you look at the wages of college graduates, they've grown 2.5 times faster than high school graduates. And then you look at where the unemployment is, it's 2 to 3 times higher amongst the unskilled. And obviously, we've got this issue of youth unemployment, and haven't got time to get into all the details behind that, but multiple factors in terms of youth unemployment. So that's where we were. That's how the world has got to. So let's just do a quick picture of how this might change going forward. And then I'll spend a few minutes of what this means for you and for your clients. We're going to be entering this period of intensifying labour challenges going forward. So the types of issues I've laid out are only going to get worse going forward. Let's just give some sort of examples. We're going to see this continuing skill issue about, skilling, people becoming more skilled. We're going to have this race against the machine. I'll go through each of these. First of all, if we look at where the growth in the labour force is going to come from. Over the last 30 years, 20 years, India and China have added a lot, and the young developing countries have been part of the contribution. Well, over the next 20 or 30 years, we're going to be seeing the ageing coming in. And you can see which countries are in which category in the report, but we're going to see China particularly contributing less to the global labour growth. Advanced economies, and some advanced economies it goes negative. In Russia, it goes negative. The number of people working in the labour force in Russia shrinks. And the growth in the labour force is going to come particularly from India and what we call the young developing countries, and that's largely Pakistan and Africa in terms of where that's going to be. So we're going to see this change in labour force as the ageing comes through in China and the OECD countries, where the growth of the labour force is only going to come from participation rate changes. It's not going to come from demographics. But we're also going to see that India and China are going to not just be playing an unskilled game. They're going to be part of the graduate game. If you look at the world supply of graduates over the next 20 years, over half of the supply of graduates are going to come from India and China. So India and China is no longer just a source of unskilled labour. It's a source of skilled labour too. You need to be ready to think about what that means for some of your clients, and I'll come back and talk about that challenge. Manufacturing, now let's just talk about the second thing, the demand. We're going to see this continuous decline in manufacturing. I talked about how 17 million jobs have disappeared in manufacturing. Here you can just see as countries get richer, how manufacturing goes up and then declines. And this is a standard sort of curve that you see in many different cases. We don't think that's going to be changing. And we're going to see the same sort of pattern of changes, that the interactive jobs, the jobs that require the sort of skilled jobs, are going to increase. The basic production jobs, bashing metal, converting something to something else, are going to decline. And then transaction jobs also going to decline as they're going to be replaced by computers, etc. So we're going to see the same type of thing going forward, that we're going to see this shift towards jobs that require greater level of skill. We're also going to see this growth in educated people. That's going to carry on, the number of people with tertiary education. We think that's going to carry on, but as we play the picture forward, we don't think there's going to be enough of them still. Even with India and China churning out the number of graduates they're going to do, we think we're going to still be creating more jobs requiring skills than we're going to be supplying. So we're going to be short tertiary, and we're going to be long people primary education. This is looking at advanced economies, and the picture's the same globally. So we're going to enter this world where the inequality we've seen so far is actually going to continue to get worse in terms of this, because the jobs again being created with people with skills, and the people, we're adding people to the labour force who are, on balance, some skilled but some unskilled. We're also going to be massively short of science, technology, engineering, and maths. This chart is quite horrific, particularly if you come from the US, and I'll come back and talk about the US in a few minutes. But this shows how many people have science, technology, engineering, maths, and a lot of those jobs that are being created require these types of graduate degrees. You see countries like Singapore churn out 50%, while countries like the US, it's 14%. I was on a panel with a former Prime Minister of New Zealand on this, and he said, this was a killing chart for him, because his big regret was he, when he had been Prime Minister, had expanded the number of people in New Zealand with degrees. And he said that was his best thing he did, but his biggest mistake on that is he let the academics decide what subjects to teach them. His big mistake is he said, I would have sort of said, we're going to expand it, but I'm going to decide, or we will centrally decide what we're going to be taught. We don't need any more people, and I'm sorry, for some of you may have journalist degrees, but we don't need more people in New Zealand with journalist degrees. We need more engineers, scientists, technology and maths. And that was sort of an interesting question. And you look at some of the challenges some of the countries face in terms of the shortage of this. The fourth change is about the geographic mismatch. I'll come back and talk about that. And then the final one is around aging. If you look at the number of elderly workers in the labour force, how that's going to carry on going up globally and particularly in advanced economies. And this is a challenge. I was talking to someone who runs a bank in Korea, and he was saying his challenge when he comes to the bank tellers is that in Korea, you have to pay people more each year. So there's an element of compensation that comes with tenure. And so a 50-year-old bank teller or a 60-year-old bank teller is paid quite a lot more than a 20-year-old bank teller. He also, though, says the productivity of bank tellers, the number of mistakes or the speed they hand out cash, drops after 30. So his problem is, as his population of his workforce moves to over 50 as the mean, they become more expensive but less productive. And you have to think about some of your clients when they're talking about elderly workers, about whether they face that problem. I'll come back and talk about there is some issues about how we cope with some of this stuff, because as we enter a more elderly, some elderly people are more productive, but there's a bunch of professions where that isn't the case, and how we cope with thinking about compensation in that world. So let's just talk very briefly about the US and the US job challenge. And it sort of has slightly disappeared from the press because of the conversation about all of the problems in politics on this. But the US job challenge is actually much bigger than many of us think. Certainly, it's easy to think that the problem has been passed. And I want to pick up a couple of elements of it. First of all, the geographic nature. And some of you may have seen this chart. This shows the unemployment rate by states. And you can see that there is areas of the US where really unemployment isn't that high, and then the areas where it's very high. Now, in the past, that was dealt with by labour mobility. People used to move. If the jobs weren't there, they would move somewhere else. The problem is, if we look at mobility in the US, is that it's halved over this period, since 1950. And there are a bunch of factors behind this. People used to move where the jobs are, but the number of people moving houses has fallen. Now, we got behind some of this, and some of it is to do with people having negative equity on their houses and not being able to move. Some of it is a bunch of other stuff. But one of the biggest things that I found was very interesting is about the way people have married and the way you have dual careers. People used to have dual careers in the 50s, but there's obviously been an increase in that, and that makes mobility harder to do. But part of it is also people are now marrying much more into their own class, and so it's much harder to move areas. So the example that the professor explained this is, historically, the doctor would marry the nurse, and then if the doctor had to move, the nurse would move because it was a low-skill thing. Now the doctor marries another doctor, and they both have jobs in a particular area, and it's much harder. Or, I mean, the engineer marries the engineer, rather than the engineer marrying the assistant, the secretary. And that means mobility becomes harder. And that sort of structural change has locked us into unemployment being much harder to deal with in the US in terms of moving that. The other issue in the US is that we're going to carry on seeing this skill mismatch. This shows what's happened since the financial crisis. We created lots of jobs in healthcare. Jobs have disappeared in construction. Well, unfortunately, it's not possible to educate, or it's not easy to take someone who was a construction worker and move them into healthcare. And again, you can see the effect on the right-hand side, the change in jobs. We created jobs that require college graduates, while at the same time, we've destroyed jobs that have been the traditional jobs that the high school dropout goes into. And I say high school dropout, it's very easy to either think of Greece or to think about someone who's sort of failed in life. Leaving school at 16, if you lived in Michigan 50 years ago, was the right thing to do. Because at that point, you could leave school as soon as you could go and work in a car plant, you could be protected potentially by a union, you could get a good job, and you could be earning up to $50,000, $80,000 in a car plant. That was the right career thing to do. And not only had you done it, your grandparents had done it, your parents had done it. And the problem now is that many of the role models of people for whom leaving school at 16 was the right thing for several generations before their family is no longer the right thing. So it's going to take a while to work that through, as is the challenge of what people study when they go to university. I mean, the US, the number of science and technology on this chart, I think is horrific. Now, US is trying to be a manufacturing renaissance, trying to lead a bunch of technology. When only 14% of your graduates here come out with science and technology, engineering, maths degrees, it's going to be very, very difficult. And particularly if you get people in Congress saying we're not going to have any immigration. I'll come back and talk about that in a minute, because that's the only way this can be addressed. So what does this mean for you, for your clients, potentially for other people you're giving career advice to? Well, first of all, I think there's a bunch of things that need to happen on the whole skill demand side in terms of the world economy, in terms of coping with this. First of all, as you think about the supply of labor, the demand of labor, it's a matter of getting an understanding of the markets and where you can tap into different sources of labor. So I was with a large US company yesterday and talking about the fact that if they really want to get long-term large supply of engineers, they have to be tapping into that India and China group. If you're reliant on being able to recruit from that 14% of the US, you're in a very limited pool in terms of engineering talent. So it needs to be a matter of understanding where the sources are and being ready to tap into it. The second thing is, as we're going to continue to being short on high-skilled workers, what can you do as a company to raise the productivity? I think email has damaged the productivity of high-skilled workers. If you think about the typical email, 3 hours a day, typically a senior executive has to spend coping with email. That is not a good use of executive time. Are there different tools that companies can put in place to work on the productivity of high-skilled workers? It's not something companies typically spend a lot of time doing. There's a lot of discussion about how you improve the productivity of shop floor workers or the delivery fleet. But how you increase the productivity of high-skilled workers is an interesting challenge, and it's an area where I think there's not many people have really tapped into yet. The third area is around the technology investments, moving the technology investments from labor saving to skill saving. Again, it's similar to the previous point. If you're going to be in a world where we're short of skilled people, let's not just put robots in the factory. Let's think about how we can use technology to make our skilled people more productive. And again, that may be around internet, email, smart systems, etc. So that's the first thing about, thinking about the demand for skills, how companies can cope with that. The second area is about shaping the supply. The first one is what can companies do to increase the availability of the types of graduates they want? And Boeing have a program to increase the number of STEM people. I was having this conversation with my daughter, who was trying to decide whether she wanted to carry on doing maths. I was able to say to her that if she did maths, she would more likely earn $750,000 more over her lifetime from having a maths background than not. And she said, you made that number up. And I was able to produce the report and show her. She said, you made it up anyway, but maybe we did. But it's a useful number to be able to do that. Now, companies, if we are really short of STEM people and companies need to do that, there's a role that they and all of you can play in increasing the supply of the right type of labor, like the New Zealand Prime Minister, not letting necessarily the academics decide what the output of the university is going to be. The second area is around working out how to deal with older workers. This point about how to think about rebalancing compensation to how to think about how that works and how we deal with the world where we have more elderly workers and how we work with that. The third one is about the proposition to emerging market talent. The numbers that I'm seeing in China at the moment in terms of turnover of talent within emerging market companies, within developed market companies, is that many of the people they hire, their attrition rate runs at 30 to 40%. 20 years ago, the top companies to work for in China were all multinationals. There were only, in the top 10, there were only 2 Chinese companies on the list. Now, 7 or 8 of the top list are all Chinese. So, the proposition for those of you who are in US or Europe trying to get Chinese talent to join is getting harder. Now, what's the proposition that you can offer to a Chinese person instead of them going off and working with a local Chinese firm that's much cooler, like Alibaba or whatever? The other point here is about the previous discussion we had about boards. I think having more women on the boards is a very good thing. I'm a great believer, and I'm very pleased with the work that's been going on in the UK. I think the diversity for emerging market boards is even worse. I look at the typical boards of a US company, and I try and think about how they're going to have a conversation about getting ready for the extra 3 billion emerging market consumers. And I look at the experience of the boards there. And I think, the women on board problem is small in comparison to that. And I'll come back to why that's important in a final thought. So a couple of other points just about, your role in shaping policy with governments. There's a lot that I think you can do about the debate on the education sector, about what the type of things that need to come out, and then the case on immigration. There's a lot of politics going on in immigration, as you all know, in multiple countries. But if your businesses rely on engineers and your universities are only producing 15% of the graduates with engineering backgrounds, science, technology, engineering, and maths backgrounds, and you're not able to get immigrants coming in, you're going to have those jobs disappear and all the second-order jobs there. And you talk to manufacturers, as I'm sure you all do, or anyone who requires technical abilities, and one of the reasons they're moving outside is that they would like to bring immigrants in with the backgrounds, but they're unable to because of the visa system, etc. So that's the sort of the background on this. Just a closing thought then. We're in the midst of this massive transition. It's going to be a phenomenally good news story for many people. We're bringing many people out of poverty. We're creating a global consuming class that's going to help drive economic growth. We're adding a huge number of skilled people to the workforce. People with skills are doing very well. People who are unskilled, we're going to face a big problem. And for many of your clients, this is going to be a challenge. And it's a challenge not only on the talent side, it's also a challenge on positioning themselves for the emerging markets. And I just want to close with this other piece of analysis. I haven't got it on a chart. When we looked at emerging market companies, the companies that the talent, when you go to China, really wants to work for, the companies that in India, the talent really wants to work for, these emerging market companies are growing 20%, twice the speed of their developed world peers. Now, that may not be a surprise if you look in emerging markets, the fact they're growing 20% twice the speed. But they're not just doing it in their home emerging market, they're doing it in other emerging markets too. So the Thai company selling in Malaysia is growing twice as fast as the US company trying to sell in Malaysia. But the really scary thing is that they're also growing twice as fast in developed markets. So emerging market companies are growing twice as fast in developed markets than their developed market peers. Now, that may seem surprising, but remember, we've seen this tape before. It was Japan in consumer electronics. It's Korea in consumer electronics and auto. Now, this is the tape we're seeing. It's now going to be the Chinese companies, the Indian companies, And yes, they're coming off a low base, but they are growing more. And I believe at the heart of why they're able to do this is their talent proposition. And I think that for all of your clients, if they can't get their talent proposition right, that they're able to tap in to this pool of talent in emerging markets, the 50% of the world's supply of graduates, your clients in developed worlds are going to suffer from this, and they're not going to be able to keep up. And I think the next 20 years is going to be really key on this, because when we look through these transitions, when these transitions happen, like we're seeing now, the companies that come out of the transition ahead typically lock in a structural advantage that lasts for 50 to 100 years. The top brands in the US in 1925, over half of them are still the top brands now. The structural advantage established then in that period of transition have remained structural advantage for 75 years afterwards. And I think the risk for many of your clients is if they're not able to tap into what's going on to emerging markets, they're not able to tap into the talent proposition, they're going to find that what happened in consumer electronics with the Japanese and the Koreans, what's happening in autos with some of the Korean players and the German players is going to happen to them. And it's not even that they're going to lose the opportunity to grow in emerging markets, they're going to lose their competitive advantage at home. So that's your challenge. Thank you.